Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Conversation, brought to you by the Windsor Park Neighborhood Association. My name is Martin Lukey, and I'm chair of the Climate Committee. Tonight, our subject is the hidden danger of methane. It's a very serious subject, and we have a great set of panelists for you tonight. First of all, from Cornell University, we have Dr. Bob Howarth, who is an Earth system scientist and ecosystem biologist. He is the David R. Atkinson Professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell University. Dr. Howarth has published over 250 scientific papers, reports, and book chapters, and has edited or authored 8 books. His peer-reviewed papers have been cited more than 75,000 times in other peer-reviewed literature, making him one of the 100 most cited environmental scientists in the world. And he's also made the Time Magazine 50 People Who Matter list. Dr. Howarth, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thanks for that introduction.
I'd like to also introduce Barrett Sundberg, our co-host, with our other panelists.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. It's very good to see you tonight. Our next panelist is Colin Leyden. He is the Texas Political Director of the Environmental Defense Fund. Colin is responsible for coordinating and promoting EDF's political engagement in Texas from the local level to the state legislature. Areas of expertise for him include oil and gas, energy policy, ground level ozone, and air quality. And Colin, thank you for joining us tonight.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And our other panelist tonight is Madison Madden. She is the Austin Market Manager for Ridwell Waste Management. She's a climate activist, a zero waste block leader, and author of the best-selling book, Mind, Body, Food. Her focus is on helping people transition to more sustainable lifestyles. Madison, thanks for joining us.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks, guys.
All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about a subject that really people know very little about, and it is extraordinarily important due to the nature of the strength of methane as a greenhouse gas. And we have one of the foremost authorities on this gas, and that is Dr. Bob Howarth. Bob, if you can, give us a rough kind of background of how much methane we are dealing with now, and maybe some kind of short history of where it stands as we face the future.
Sure, happy to do that. You know, I think the best context is the latest UN report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the very latest synthesis reports, the first update since 2013. It tells us that methane is responsible for 0.5 degrees Celsius warming over all time. Compare that with 0.75 degrees for carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a more important greenhouse gas, but not by much, right? And yet, 99% of our focus is on carbon dioxide. Methane is, 67% of the way up there in terms of being equally important. It also dissipates from the atmosphere more quickly than does carbon dioxide. And so it gives us one of the easiest ways to slow the rate of global warming. There's a report from the United Nations Environmental Program from last May, and they said globally, it's probably cost effective, relatively easy even, to reduce methane emissions by 45% globally before this decade is out, the next 7.5 years from now. And to do so would carve 0.3 degrees off of the global warming that we'd otherwise see by 2040 or so. Now keep in mind, we're trying to, keep the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial baseline. Everyone thinks that that's a danger point. We run the risk of runaway global warming if we hit that kind of temperature. So, carving that 0.3 out of there is important. Methane comes from all sorts of sources. There are natural sources, but there are also human sources. And I think the two biggest ones we need to worry about here in the US are from the fossil fuel industry, principally the oil and gas industry. coal too, but principally oil and gas industry and animal agriculture. And they're both important. And we in the scientific community argue a
So
lot.
I have friends who
that. Yeah, go ahead.
I have friends who, when I bring up the topic of methane, they say, "Are you going to talk about the cows?"
Yeah, well, actually, a lot of people think the cows are the biggest source. We can come back to that. My research suggests otherwise. My research suggests oil and gas is a bigger source, but they're both important. And I want to acknowledge that there's a true scientific debate there. Let me just put one more thing on the sort of global perspective, though, because methane was going up rapidly in the 20th century, and then it slowed. I mean, it actually stopped. Methane emissions stabilized for the first decade of this century, and it's been going up again since 2006 or 2007. Last year, it went up more than ever before, most rapid rate ever. So we're moving in the wrong direction. And we scientists do argue about whether it's cows or oil and gas. It's both. It's a question of which is more important. But we should be addressing both, is my belief.
Well, that's why Colin's here, because he is an expert on Texas oil and gas. And Colin, what do you see coming out of basically the Permian Basin in the latest Environmental Defense Fund studies?
Yeah, sure. And let me just add, because I think this is one thing that maybe folks don't realize when we talk about methane from oil and gas. It is the primary ingredient of natural gas. So when you're burning, when you light your stove to cook your meal on your stovetop, if it's a natural gas stove, you're primarily burning methane. So important point there. Yeah, so Environmental Defense Fund has, along with Bob, have been involved in trying to quantify and characterize methane emissions across the oil and gas system. And we've been involved in numerous studies across the US and in other countries. But about 2 years ago, we launched a large project in the Permian Basin in West Texas to try and get a handle on what's happening out there. In particular, that's an oil field primarily. The operators are there for the oil, but the gas, a significant amount of gas comes up with the oil itself. It's referred to often as associated gas. And so we wanted to understand how much methane was leaking. Oftentimes these are characterized in terms of a loss rate, which is essentially total gas produced over or under gas that we estimate as being lost based on measurements. And our original estimate about 1.5 to 2 years ago was somewhere between 3.5 to 3.7% of all the gas was being lost. There was a recent study by Stanford that came out, from measurements done in 2019 in the New Mexico portion of the Permian Basin, and that had an estimated loss rate in 2019 in that area for up to 9%. If you're talking about a gas to coal conversion, taking a power plant from gas to coal, the equivalency on where that switch makes sense from a climate perspective is about 2.7% loss rate. And of course, that's done over a time range. So it gets a little bit tricky in even talking about that. But the point is there's way too much gas being lost in the Permian Basin. It's bad for the climate. It's a loss of money. It's a waste of a resource. The companies with the most aggressive targets for a loss rate on methane are targeting a 0.2% loss rate. So you can see that that's wildly out of whack with what even the companies that are saying they'd like to be responsible are achieving out in West Texas.
So just to see if I heard this right, are you saying that if they throw off too much of this gas while they're pulling the oil out, it's worse than if they were running the power plant on coal?
That's essentially it. If that gas is used in a power plant and loss rate from all that gas that's being burned is more than 2.7%, the immediate return to the climate is negligible. If that makes sense.
Certainly, you're just discombobulating us here right now, because we're all been told that natural gas was better to use than coal, and so
We have to keep in mind there's timelines associated with that, and maybe Bob, you might want to elaborate on that. But I mean, the higher the loss rate, the longer it takes for the methane to clear out of the atmosphere. So there's a graph and a link I can show you to our chief scientist, Steve Hamburg, put out a blog on this, and you can see kind of the curve of the loss rate for a coal to gas conversion, and what that timeline looks like depending on what the loss rate is. But the point is if methane emissions aren't controlled, then the benefit to the climate is severely hampered.
So let me just elaborate. Can I elaborate just a little bit on that comparison? I mean, the 2.7% emission rate for natural gas to give you the break even with coal, it's exactly right. That's out of work is originally done by Ramon Alvarez, who works for Environmental Defense, I think in Texas, and others, is published in Science. It's great work, but from 2012 though, right? So the science on methane's been moving quickly. And I published a paper with Cornell colleagues back in 2011 looking at the comparison, and people love to contrast what we said versus what EDF says, like we're fighting or something. And we've always been at 87 to 97% agreement. We've never been 100% agreement, but always kind of in the same ballpark. Bottom line is that the idea that natural gas could be a bridge fuel instead of coal, it's an outdated concept. It made sense 15, 20 years ago. We couldn't produce enough solar and wind power, so we're stuck with coal plants, and let's get rid of the coal plants because we can have natural gas plants which put out less carbon dioxide to produce the same amount of electricity. And that's all true, but the methane emissions offset that, and they make it no better. Colin's exactly right. The time frame over which we consider that gets really, really complicated, and there are different ways to do it. But at this point, it really is an outdated argument, because we know that the future of electricity is wind and solar and hydro, right? It's renewable. So we're not really talking about replacing coal with gas. If we're going to replace coal, it's with renewables. The remaining issue, I think, is how else we use natural gas. And we use it for home heating. We use it to make hydrogen for fertilizer production. We use a bunch of things there. And those are primarily the emissions we need to start moving away from. So I think we ought to be thinking not in terms of which is worse, coal or natural gas. They're both bad. You need to move away from them. How do we wean ourselves though off of the uses of natural gas beyond the electricity, which is relatively easy to get rid of? I think that's the real challenge moving forward.
You mentioned that there's some natural and other forms of methane occurring. I want to get Madison in on this at the moment. Madison, what do you have any numbers or arena of where else, say in the waste management world, about methane being produced?
Well, as these two, I'm sure, know, the oil and gas and agriculture are number one and number two, or number one and number one, if you want to put it that way. And number three is landfills in the United States. So landfills contribute about 15 to 16% of human-made methane in our atmosphere. And that comes from a few different sources. It comes from food waste. It comes from the landfills themselves with, consumer, municipal solid waste and industrial waste. An interesting thing that I'd like to bring to the conversation that, a lot of people feel fairly unempowered in some of these, big industry considerations of oil and gas and agriculture, and don't have necessarily a personal relationship with what I can do to, participate in this. Whereas the landfill part of this is something that we have empowerment over all of them in some way, shape, or form, and we can talk about that. But in the recognition that every day we produce waste and we often don't think about it. It is out of sight, out of mind to a landfill producing methane every day. As well as food waste, there's a paper that was published in the journal Science that said that emissions from global food production alone could lead to a global temperature increase of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century, even if emissions from fossil fuels were to end immediately. So that's a pretty big deal, that even though it's not number one, these things that we are dealing with every day as consumers and as human beings are affecting this in a way that, Dr. Howarth talked about. If we could get a grip on methane, this is our chance in the next few years to reduce methane emissions to the point that we can have a big impact on global emissions in a way that we don't quite have the ability to with CO2 emissions alone. So those are, important parts of the conversation as well.
So what are some of these things that can be done to actually reduce the methane? Are we talking laws, or is it like, do we just, I don't know, waste less food? What are the things that need to be done to actually reduce the methane?
Can I give you a New York example? And then Colin can weigh in on certainly other things that EGF is talking about in terms of the oil and gas industry. In New York, we have pretty progressive climate legislation passed back in 2019. We have a law that says we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions statewide by 40%, 7.5 years from now. And we have to go to carbon neutrality by 2050. It says other things. We actually set up our own accounting system for greenhouse gas emissions too, which weighs methane much more heavily than any other state. We use a shorter time frame for doing so because we think that's a more accurate characterization. But so we've been looking closely at how to do this. I'm actually on the commission that's charged with coming up with the way to implement the plan. And we're looking particularly at methane because it's so critical to get the methane stuff under control. And the methane emissions primarily in our state are coming, the number one source is our heating of homes and commercial buildings. So, we are calling for a ban on use of gas in new construction as of 2024. We have 6 million single family residences, which now heat with fossil fuels. 4.5 million of those are natural gas, and we're calling for phasing those out over the following 15 years. So from the fossil fuel industry, we're talking about reducing our use of natural gas by half by 2035, just by getting it out of the heating system, principally. But following up on what Madison said, our number two source, we have a big dairy industry in New York. We're the second or third largest dairy industry in the country, but that's not our second methane source. The second one is our landfills. And she's exactly right. Landfills are a huge problem. So we're talking about making it, you no longer will be allowed to put anything that would decompose to methane into a landfill. No wood waste, no cardboard, no food waste. We're gonna do other stuff with it to get out of that stream. And the third source is our dairy farms. And there we're looking at changing the way you feed cows, because how much, the methane from cows is mostly what they burp, and it comes from what they feed. It's bacteria in their gut, and what they eat and how we feed them makes a big difference. So those are the three things we're pushing in New York. And I know, other states will look at it differently, and there are other things you could do with natural gas. EDF has put a lot of effort into thinking about how to reduce emissions from the natural gas structure. Personally, I like the New York approach. Let's get rid of the gas and not worry about the details, but they're, both could be done.
Dr. Howarth, I'm curious about your perspective. We were talking about this pre-show about landfill gas options and what you think about that and what research is showing on the efficiency of rolling out programs.
Yeah, well, there are two things, right? We want to no longer get as much methane formed in the landfill. So it's coming from the bacteria degrading what we put in there. So you don't want to feed the bacteria. So get rid of the food waste, get rid of the paper waste and all. That's the long-term strategy. It's going to take a while. That's bacteria work on stuff for 30 years. So if we do a good job over the next decade, the landfills are still going to be putting out methane, 30, 40 years into the future. In the meanwhile, you want to trap that methane and use it, right? You don't want to put it to the atmosphere. It's an energy resource. We want to use it. And we have a very active debate in New York. There are some who say, let's put that into our current natural gas infrastructure system, into the pipeline system if you want. I don't think we should. I don't think it's a big enough resource. I think we should degasify the state, get rid of that gas infrastructure, and collect and use the methane on site to generate electricity on site. But that's an active debate we're having in the state.
And just not everybody's familiar with what we were just talking about, so I just want to fill in everybody on it. Landfill gas, or what's often referred to as renewable natural gas, is a gas that can be collected from a landfill. The methane gas gets collected from the landfill itself and then reused as energy. And it is considered a renewable green energy, but there's debate, as he was saying, about how efficient that is, how costly it is, what the consequences are of it.
How
the city of Austin is most definitely checking in on the RNG options, and have actually published a paper just recently on it. So I think certain progressive cities and states are looking at it, but I don't know. Colin, are there any answers on that so far in Texas?
On the renewable natural gas question?
Yes.
I mean, I think I probably tend to lean, just from what I've read, and I'm not an expert on this, but it's a limited resource. I think that there's been some studies showing that you can minimally reduce the carbon impact by mixing renewable natural gas or landfill natural gas with existing natural gas. But to Bob's point, we have to greatly reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. It's not to say that there probably won't be some municipalities and areas that continue to experiment with this option, but I don't think most climate folks think it's much of a long-term solution.
We've had a viewer ask, would composting help with some of the waste that's going into landfills if it was done on a large scale?
Well, Madison can answer. Let me just give you the quick science example. I'm a science nerd, right? if the composting is done well, the trick is the bacteria that produce methane do it off of labile organic matter if there's no oxygen available. If composting is done well, it's being mixed and there's oxygen there all the time, so there's no methane. If it's not done well, it's producing methane. So that's a trick. And in New York, we're thinking about composting versus purposefully digesting it in anaerobic digesters and capturing the methane more effectively. So I think we should experiment with both and see.
I was going to say the same thing, composting done well. And then the other factor of that is reducing food waste in general. And that's something that everybody can participate in.
Right now, the city of Austin has a composting program that allows us to take our food waste and put it on the curb, and they take it to their own composting systems. So we do have a very progressive composting system here in Austin, and all we have to do is use it.
We have another viewer question, one about what individuals can do. And viewers, if you haven't done so yet, you have questions, by all means, just put them in the comments of the YouTube, and we'll have a volunteer pass them on to us. So we will do our best to get those onto the air and get your question answered. So someone has asked, for individuals, what options do we have for cooking instead of gas?
Well, I'll jump in here and someone else can too, but induction stoves, electric stoves. And people, when you say that, people say, oh no, I hate electric stoves. Well, we're not talking about the stove that you've experienced where it gets hot and you see it glow red and it takes forever to heat up and you're waiting around for your water to boil for minutes. These are electromagnetic driven technology in which you can boil water on an electric induction stove quicker than you can on a gas stove, and you don't have to deal with all of the NOx and the other fumes that are really we're finding more and more science about the indoor air quality problems that are associated with cooking with natural gas. So I would encourage everyone, if you're thinking about switching or your old gas stove is at the end of its life, like ours is here at my house, they sell them at Home Depot now. You can buy it as a range, so it's both an oven, an electric oven, but then an induction cooktop on top. You can buy it that way, or you can just buy the cooktop. A lot of excitement in the climate world around induction stoves.
Well, so here in Windsor Park, most of the homes had gas stoves installed originally. So what we would need to look for then, your induction is the key word, not just electric, but induction.
That is the key word. There's a lot of difficult issues around electrifying our houses, as Dr. Howarth pointed out. A lot of our natural gas goes to our homes, and we need to electrify our homes, but it's not a simple process. We need to figure out policies to make it easier. In addition to making sure you're looking for the word induction, you will need to upgrade. If you don't have a 220 electric line running to where the stove is, you'll have to upgrade that electric line to a 220. Just means it's got more juice in it than your typical electric line.
So does that kind of mean it needs to be wired like a washing machine is wired?
Or an electric dryers are typically with a 220 electric plug. I mean, it's not super complicated, but it's one of the extra things you have to do.
I can testify that I do have one of these range tops in my house, and I've had it for a really long time, and I've kind of taken it for granted now, but it works fantastic. And whenever anybody says what kind of stove range top you have, I just say electric, because I don't think the word induction. But yeah, it's quite effective, and not the old school version at all. I highly recommend them.
Well, that's kind of exciting. We actually have viewers that have tuned in from as far as Illinois. This is not just Texas or Windsor Park. And not all cities have the rapidly improving sort of quality of electricity generation sourcing that Austin does. But if I'm understanding correctly, no matter where you are and what the source of the electricity is, using it instead of gas is still going to be an improvement. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. The thing about beneficial electrification, both for cooking and for heating and all, in terms of heating, we'd be moving to high efficiency heat pumps. And even if the electricity for those or for the induction stovetops is coming from mostly fossil energy, the greenhouse gas emissions go down. But the grids are going to be getting cleaner over time anyway, right? So we need to be moving both. And I was just going to say, if you're not quite ready to pull your gas stove out yet and go fully, hog wild and all, I mean, you should. It's long term to where we're going, but you can experiment for about $150. You can buy an induction wok and do your stir frying and all with it. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. My house is 100% carbon neutral. I heat with geothermal heat, but I'll confess that my stovetop is still propane, and I haven't pulled it out yet. So,
well, the idea that we need to electrify our houses is the backbone of the answer to what we can do at home. It literally is. When the old equipment wears out, we need to bring in the electrified version of the new equipment, and that includes water heaters. And there's one in my house that's about to get replaced. I'm about to run the electricity myself because it's about time to electrify that. It's the last thing in my house that I haven't done, except for, of course, heating the house itself. That's another big ticket item, of course. But I think as we approach these decisions, if we do them a little at a time over a period of time, just like phasing out fossil fuels over the next 15 years, we need to do the same thing in our own houses.
So I don't know who wants to address this, but so what proportion of the change we're trying to make needs or can readily be done by individuals, and how much kind of needs to be done on some sort of system basis? And if there's a lot on the system basis, is it legislation that we need, or how should we accomplish that?
Well, it's a good question. And the answer is we need the policy, institutional changes. I mean, individual actions, I'm not going to say aren't important. Electrifying your house, doing the things we were just talking about, all make a difference, but we need the big policy changes to really make a difference. And that's
so what sort of policies need to be happening? Are there laws proposed and being discussed, or do the whole proposals have to be advanced? What should these laws be saying?
Let me give you the New York example again, because our law does specify that we have to reduce our emissions 40% across the economy, which includes transportation, includes home heating, it includes electricity, et cetera. Home heating in New York, it's cold here in the winter. It's our #1 greenhouse gas emission source for sure. So, we're going to ban gas and fossil fuels in new construction, but we have this retrofitting problem, right? Well, that's expensive. That's throwing a lot on asking, millions and millions of people to do. We need mechanisms to carry that off. And the sort of things we're talking about are, say, perhaps encouraging utilities to no longer deliver gas to the home, but instead deliver 50-degree water to the home. So use ground source heat pumps. If you understand a heat pump, it's extracting heat from the environment, putting it into your home, And for every 1 unit of electrical input, a good ground source heat pump will give you 5 units of heat energy in. You can do that home by home, but it's probably more effective, cost effective, probably more efficient to do it at the neighborhood scale. And if we can get the utilities providing the exchange fluid and people just own the heat pump, then the costs come down substantially. And the utilities have the advantage of being able to get 50-year, really large capital investments to pay for this. So in fact, in the way we're viewing it, you can switch from going from natural gas to using your heat pump. Your electric, your heating bill will be the same. You'll pay for the water exchange and electricity instead of for the gas, but your costs won't go up. The utility is bearing that cost long term on a long distance loan, and to you, you don't even notice it. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to do. That's consistent with the New York law, but we need to enact the details to make it actually happen.
And I'll just mention 2 federal policies that EDF is very interested in. One is methane regulations for the oil and gas industry, which we think are absolutely necessary to reduce emissions in that sector. And the EPA has put forth an initial proposal and is going to be following up, we think, in about 3 or 4 months with a secondary proposal addressing methane emissions throughout the production side of oil and gas, as well as some of the midstream sectors. So we think that's vitally important federal regulation. And then, of course, there's what used to be called the Build Back Better Act, which the Biden administration and Democrats in the House are pushing, and they passed it in the House, and it's been hung up in the Senate with our good friend Senator Manchin from West Virginia. We're hopeful that some of that Build Back Better money is going to make it back out of the Senate and back to the House. It was roughly $500 billion worth of incentives and various other carrots and sticks around increasing our renewable energy. We know that we can convert our electric system to at least a 80% renewable energy in a short period of time. And so the Build Back Better Act included lots of tax credits for renewable energy and various other things, along with infrastructure money for EVs and rebates for EVs for people to purchase them. So electrifying our transportation system was also a part of that package. So we still remain hopeful that we're going to see something there, but that's the kind of initiative that we need out of the federal government.
I will add that policy is absolutely fundamental and necessary. And policy is created by people and groups of people. And what we see environmentally is a ping-ponging of policies based on our regimes. And so I would argue that the consumer's voice and consumers voting with their dollar and their, local initiatives, their local governments and things like that are an important part of moving this type of transition to a federal level that isn't so bipartisan, because ultimately that's not going to get us anywhere, in my humble opinion.
Colin, is there anything on the Texas level in regards to capturing any of these gases that are basically being released? What do they call it? Flaring and venting.
Yeah. Well, we unfortunately in Texas really don't have a political leadership that is all that cooperative or helpful on the climate front, and they haven't certainly been that way on the oil and gas industry. It's one of the reasons why, I mean, honestly, Texas is poster child number one of why we need federal methane regulations. Unlike New Mexico, Colorado, California, Pennsylvania, some of these other oil and gas producing states that have implemented comprehensive methane regulations, Texas refuses to do so. There have been some progress on flaring. So flaring is the process of burning the actual gas in a flare stack in the production field. Sometimes it's unavoidable due to an emergency situation, but unfortunately what we've seen over the years in Texas is rampant flaring for convenience. It's simply the oil and gas companies are there for the oil. The gas, if they can make money off of the gas, that's fine. But if they can't, well, they've built the economics around the oil of the well, so we'll just burn the gas and we'll get, we don't want to spend the money on the gas infrastructure to get that gas to market. So we're just gonna burn it in a flare. Problem is, and burning the flare is better than burning that gas at a flare is better than releasing it directly into the atmosphere. The problem is these flares malfunction at an extremely high rate. Our research in the Permian Basin found about 10% of all flares in the basin were malfunctioning, meaning they weren't burning either all of their gas or they were venting the entirety of their gas into the atmosphere. So we know that methane emissions in the Permian Basin, flaring is one of the largest drivers. There has been some progress in Texas on that over the last year and a half, 2 years. Most of that's been driven by the capital markets. Number one, telling oil and gas industry that we don't care so much how much oil you're producing. We just want you to make money and give us the money back that you haven't given us over the last 10 years that we've been investing in you. And so that's caused the production to slow down and be a little bit more deliberate. So that's caused less flaring. And then some of the capital markets have also said, we want to see you perform better on the environment. So some of the companies have made some progress on flaring. Our regulatory bodies have done really close to nothing on flaring, unfortunately, and the EPA is considering banning routine flaring as part of these methane regulations, and we're encouraging them to do that.
Well, that'll change the look of some of West Texas. I drove through West Texas just a couple of weeks ago, and there's a state park that's right next to the roadside on the route to El Paso, and it's completely surrounded by methane flares. And it's really spooky to drive past it at night and think there's people sleeping right there amidst it's like a giant ring of tiki torches. So it's very visible out in the field.
That's a good point, and I agree with what Colin has said too. But in addition to the problem with flares not always being effective, or sometimes they just plain go out, particularly in more populated areas, say south of here in Pennsylvania. I live pretty close to the Pennsylvania border. Sometimes they vent, that is, not burn it rather than flaring, even though that's really not legal there because it's an invisible gas. It's hard to see, it's hard to know, and actually people complain more with the flaring. Flaring, it can sound like a jet engine and it's visible for tens of miles around. The venting is invisible and more quiet, and so sometimes the industries will just vent it, which is worse. Flaring's bad too. It has other air pollution issues, but if you had to choose, we want to flare versus venting. But there are many reasons that sometimes they'll cut the corners and vent.
I think I read recently in a report by your group, Colin, EDF, did an equation based upon an extrapolation of all of the venting and flaring going on across the entire United States. And they came up with the number of cars that it would equal, and it was 42 million.
Yeah, it's an enormous amount of natural gas that's being wasted as well. I mean, beyond the climate, the climate impact is significant, and it's also an enormous waste. Yeah, we've run so many different calculations on different basins on natural gas and flaring. I think that one of our latest ones is if we stopped 90% of the U.S. flaring and captured 70% of methane emission loss, that would be equivalent to about half of the LNG that the U.S. has pledged to Europe per year. So it's you know, as you can see, it's just it's an enormous problem for the industry, and really, you know, it's crazy that we've tolerated it this long.
Well, thanks to the Environmental Defense Fund for really looking into that, which when it fell across my desk, that's the reason why we're doing this show, is I realized that we had a much larger problem than anybody understood. So one other thing we haven't talked about, and that is all the methane trapped in the permafrost in the northern part of the planet. Dr. Howarth, do you have any numbers on that?
Well, there are two things going on. There's an enormous amount of organic carbon that's frozen in the permafrost, right? And as we melt the permafrost, we run the very real risk that the bacteria, again, just like in a ill-fated compost facility, will start to work on that organic matter. It's oxygen-free and produce a lot of methane. So that's a real concern. And, you know, we are melting the permafrost. We've lost about 17–18% of the permafrost regions of the world over the last 20 years. So that's a real issue. Interestingly, so far, we're not actually picking up increased methane emissions from that in the atmosphere. The regional monitoring and satellite monitoring don't yet show that going on. So we know there must be more methane formation, but it looks like there are also bacteria that can oxidize methane if it moves fairly slowly towards the surface. Looks like they're doing that so far, but you know, if we warm the planet more quickly, if we make these areas warmer, that could change pretty rapidly. The related issue is this thing we call methane clathrate, which is actually a frozen crystalline form of methane with water. And there the methane's already formed. It's a matter of if you melt it, if you will, and its melting point is different than ice because it's a mixture of methane and ice. But as you warm it, we could melt that. And the amount of methane that's trapped in methane clathrates globally is, you know, if we're all to melt, it would be thousands of times more methane in the atmosphere than there is now. That's a worry as we warm the planet more. But again, to date, there's no evidence that has yet become an explosive problem. There are papers, you'll see people saying we're seeing it here and there in Siberia and all, but overall, the monitoring data don't pick it up as a large global signal yet, but that could change as we warm the planet more.
Well, that actually turns into a little bit of good news there, because I thought it was a lot worse than that.
Well, I did too a while ago. I mean, Jim Hansen, a great climate scientist, obviously wrote a paper back in 2007 saying that as we warmed the planet to 1.8 degrees, he was really worried about all these methane clathrates melting. We're not at 1.8 yet, but we're at 1.1 or so. But you can see in a lot of the methane clathrates are on the continental shelves of the ocean, say at depths of 300–500 meters, something like that. And we've warmed those enough. You can see it's some melting, and you can track the bubbles rising with sonar, and the bubbles disappear before they hit the surface. They're dissolving into seawater, and the bacteria are consuming it before it gets to the atmosphere so far. But again, if you warm it faster, bigger bubbles rise faster, it could plow out into the atmosphere. So it's a good reason to not warm the planet any faster than we are.
Yeah, all of these things are really connected, and what we do now plays out 20 years from now, or even sooner. So, Madison, do you have any other things that people can do at home, or things that we can possibly try?
For some good news. I wanted to emphasize just on the topic of these numbers, cutting the world's methane emissions by what I understand as 30% over the next decade would essentially have the same effect on global warming by mid-century as immediately shifting the global transportation sector to net zero. So that's a pretty, for me, that statistic brings that to scale for me to understand what we're working with and what potential we have here. So as far as your question goes, let me share my screen if you don't mind. Hold on, sorry. You think I've done this by now a million times. So, often we want to talk about what can you and I do. I mentioned earlier, vote with your dollar, vote with your vote with your lifestyle. Ultimately, we all need to enact policy change. In these three categories, I broke down just a few things, and I would love, us to add to these as part of the conversation, because these are some basic things and they're very contextual and geographical as well. But as far as the oil and gas goes, on a day-to-day basis, we can replace our fossil fuel use with renewable energy as much as possible. So we can reduce our airplane travel and gas transportation and transition to electric vehicles. And, I don't ultimately think those are the end all be all either, but be early adopters of emerging renewable technologies, as well as what we talked about with transitioning to renewable utilities, utilizing public transportation, bikes and smaller vehicles. For instance, I have an electric Vespa, an electric scooter that I like to ride around, which works just as well and is more enjoyable than riding in a car for me most of the time. Transition to geographically relevant renewable energies for utilities. We already talked about that. And I say geographically relevant because sometimes we as humans like to think of things as black or white, good or bad. And ultimately these energies and what we're dealing with is much more complex than that. There is geographic relevance to where renewable energies are found, utilized, and sustainable. And then stop investing in oil and gas. And that comes in a lot of forms. That's very complex, that is hard to do overnight, but really understanding where our money goes and where our consumer dollars go is an important part of doing that. Changing our food habits. So, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but this is a big one that we all have ultimately a lot of creative freedom and control over. So reducing our meat and dairy consumption substantially, which is something that we don't often want to talk about. It's a pretty, charged topic to talk about. Eating more regional fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. One thing people don't often realize about their diet is that a lot of the impact of our diets comes from transportation of food, the oil and gas impact of it. As well as the refrigeration, the packaging. If you think about, a piece of packaged meat that's come from Brazil, that's been packaged, it's got the methane emissions from the cow, it's got the methane emissions from the transportation, it's got the methane emissions from the packaging that ends up in the landfill. So on all fronts there, we have improvement to be had that we have, some say over in our individual lives. Composting, which we talked about already, reducing food waste. This is something that we can all do. We're used to working and running fast and using things conveniently and not thinking about these things and don't realize what a big impact they have. So supporting sustainable farming practices. So, there's a lot of ways that we can do that locally and regionally that we often overlook. And buying locally produced food with minimal packaging. It's kind of mind-boggling to me to think about the amount of packaging waste we've produced just in COVID with all of the to-go containers and things like that. So that's something that we all have jurisdiction over. And then on the landfill front, prioritizing waste reduction. And there's a lot of ways to do this. And like I said, oftentimes these things are out of sight, out of mind until you start to think about it. So our goal as consumers as well as policymakers should be sending as little as possible to the landfill, even with the understanding of the landfill gas potential as a green energy source. Like our two guests here talked about, that's not a long-term solution that is scalable. We need to send as little as possible to the landfills and prioritize reuse. So we have, for the last few decades, we have been prioritizing disposable this, disposable that. We need to change our mindsets and our systems and our businesses around prioritizing reuse, reducing consumption and packaging. And then, on your local level, utilizing community recycling centers and zero waste initiatives. They're growing. In Austin, we have a really active zero waste community and a city that's really trying hard to move towards zero waste and is trying to lead the way in that on a national level. There's a lot of resources available. And lastly on this list, and then I'll open that up for discussion for all of the things that you guys can add that I didn't include here, would be learn the details of recycling. Oftentimes people hear the statistic that only 10% or 20% of what you put in your recycling bin gets actually recycled. Part of that is the system. And part of it is our consumer knowledge about recycling. There's a common phrase used, wish cycling, putting things in the recycling bin that you wish were going to get recycled. Which from a psychological perspective, you can understand. People like, I wish this could be recycled, put it in there, right? But ultimately, there's a lot of consequences to that. So something like plastic film, for instance, the thin, stretchable plastic. People don't realize you shouldn't put that in your recycling bin. It clogs up the recycling plants. I have one of the reasons why I spend so much time doing what I do right now with Ridwell. I have our VP of operations at Ridwell told me this story. He used to manage a MRF, a materials recycling facility in Oregon. And they would have people literally tied to the ceiling on ropes, picking out the plastic film from the conveyor belts of waste, because it causes a lot of clogging and congestion. And then ultimately more things don't get recycled because of that. Same things with things that are hazardous materials like batteries cause fires in our haulers and recycling facilities. So there's a lot of resources out there that we can learn about what we can do with the materials we have. And then once we know that, it empowers us to then make consumer decisions as to, I don't want to buy that because I know there's not a downstream for that, and that's going to end up in the landfill. So then I'm going to end my rampage there and open it up to everybody else to add to these lists.
Well, so you've covered a lot here. You're saying really, if you want to have an impact with your recycling, the main thing is to do it right. But even if you follow the rules right, it's hard to recycle everything. Can you tell our viewers a little more about Ridwell?
Sure. Yeah. Ridwell is a service that helps people waste less and fill in the gaps of municipal recycling. So the things that can't or are challenge items for recyclers, Ridwell picks up. So that includes plastic film, includes batteries, light bulbs, textiles, and in other markets outside of Austin, we're in Seattle, Portland, Denver, and Minneapolis. We also pick up styrofoam as well as paint and some other items like that that are challenging for our haulers and our recyclers to pick up for various reasons. So the answer to your question is yes, it is complex, it is challenging, and we have a responsibility both as business owners, as policymakers, as researchers, and as consumers to take responsibility for what it is that we are consuming in our life and find ways to deal with it in a sustainable manner. So that's, on there, utilize zero waste services. So Ridwell is one really great zero waste service. And I'm saying that because, I believe in it wholeheartedly, but it's not the only one. There are a lot of wonderful resources for learning about and understanding where your stuff goes.
Sounds like a large education of the public needs to occur so that we can all ramp up to the same place. Dr. Howarth, any other ideas?
Yeah, let me pick up. I agree with what Madison said, and I'm an educator, right? I'm at a university, and I was going to use the education word just before you used it, but let me pick up on that. I think what we need to do most is to educate ourselves and to be optimistic that we can actually, change the world. And I mean, it's an EDF phrase, finding ways that work to change the world. The technologies are there to recycle properly. The technologies are there to get rid of fossil fuels in our homes. The technologies are there to, ride electric scooters or electric cars or have electric buses instead of doing what we're doing. It's all there. And unfortunately, we've been suffering under decades of misinformation. If you watched Frontlines last night, they did an excellent job on part one of a 3-part series on misinformation by the oil and gas industry on climate change. There are 2 more of those coming up. And I would urge everyone to look at all 3 of them and to come out of that, irritated. We all ought to be irritated, but also optimistic. There's things we can do as an individual, but we need to do more as a society. We're not going to solve this just by individuals. We have to do it as a society overall, and we have to realize that we can. And as long as we have this defeatism, it's just too difficult and all, we're not going to be able to do it. And there are powerful forces out there who would like to encourage that defeatism by making us think it's too difficult. So I think educating ourselves is a critical part of it.
I like to say education, awareness, and then inspiration, because I think inspiration is where people actually change and come together with a quality of joy, as opposed to just kind of like, I'm doing this out of obligation. So I think we have a great potential there to come together on this.
I totally agree. The joy in knowing we can do it. And just, it's so remarkable to know that we can and make a difference collectively. Individually, okay, but collectively, we're much more powerful.
Well, I take solace in looking at the polling. I'm a little bit of a political animal, and I like to read polls, as limiting as they are. But when you look at what people under 35 think about climate change, I've been in politics and around policy and advocacy for many, many years, and was always trying to get candidates to talk about climate change. And they'd say, well, yeah, I do. I agree. I think this is something that I support. But, look at the polling. It's number 7 or 8 down on the list of things that people want. But when you look now at people under 35 or 40, it's often typically the top issue of concern for them, at least in the top 3. And that's across both political parties. So I do have hope and some joy in thinking about the next generations that are coming and their attitudes towards, the immediacy and the urgency around climate change.
Well, I have found since we started this idea with our neighborhood association on a very small scale in the east side of Austin, that everywhere we go to talk about this, we get a massively positive response. And so I know that out there in the world, everyone is willing to participate, and all we need are some tools. And I think tonight we actually discussed a number of them, and hopefully our viewers will take that to heart and start doing some of them. I want to thank you all for all being here to discuss this subject and bring some light to the idea of how it is that we change the world and bring joy. And Barrett, do you have any closing thoughts or comments?
Thank you very much to all of our panelists and taking what you said to heart. Thank you all.
All right, that's it for tonight. This has been another edition of the Climate Conversation from the Windsor Park Neighborhood Association. We'll be back again in a couple of months and with another great topic and another set of great panelists.